All right, well, good morning. Been thinking about how to start this topic. Can you imagine the world without suffering? Sounds pretty good, right? It's a pretty good deal. If you have a choice between taking the world without suffering and the world with suffering, what would you take? You take the world without suffering. It's like the obvious choice. Would you take the lottery winning ticket, or would you take the lottery losing ticket? I'll take the lottery winning ticket every time. Thank you very much. But one of the things that I observe in kind of like the behavioral science community and the religious community where we agree is that people are notoriously bad at being good arbiters of their own fate. We are not good at making decisions that are in our own best interest. And we just saw it in the story with the kids, right? The spy's going to land. Is this land good? Yes or no? Yeah, it is good, but there's some problems there. What do? Oh, we stay here. Thank you very much. We are not going to go in there and get ourselves squashed. Not very good arbiters of their own fate, right? They don't really understand what's going to make them happy. And there might have been some suffering and some challenges along that path. But the reward would have been worth it, wouldn't it? The reward of going in there, Lord's on my side, boom, in we go. Yes, we're going to take it, and yep, we're going to take our lumps along the way. But in the end, we will be triumphant. And I bet that had they done that, they might have looked back on it and said, you know what? I wouldn't change a thing. And I bet there are even some people who went through the 40 years of suffering in the desert, got into the Holy Land, and had that same reaction. I wouldn't change a thing. Because in our wandering in the desert and through our trials and what, we actually had an experience of God in our life. And I think that's the point. We want to have that experience of God, of knowing that He's here with us, He's doing things for us, He's on our side, and no matter how bad things get, there's a healing that goes on through the trials and struggles of life. I came across an article by a woman who had a little girl with Down syndrome. And here's a little bit of what she writes. She says, I had lived in the hospital an hour from home for 9 weeks, 8 of those weeks in my last trimester of pregnancy. I had laid in the hospital bed praying for Alyssa to survive healthy and without any complications. At last she came with a few complications, and after a 6-day natal intensive care unit stay, we finally made it home with our beautiful little girl. In those quiet months after her birth, we had so much joy and felt great peace and thanksgiving over her life. But even in the midst of so much joy, sorrow would still visit me too. Down syndrome had only been in my vocabulary since April of that year, when my obstetrician first suspected it of my unborn baby. Grief had become a familiar friend as we walked through a high-risk pregnancy, and through much grief had been spent and processed by the time she had arrived, and some remained. One thing I don't get, she'd asked her friend Natalie. There are some of these parents whose kids have Down syndrome, and they're years ahead of us in the process, and they say, I wouldn't change a thing. But you know what? I think they're lying. Who would choose this for their kid? I wouldn't. I would change it all. Every last bit of it. Her friend says, well, of course you would. Of course you would. Isn't that kind of the obvious choice? How can these people tell me that this is a good thing? I would change that away in a heartbeat, right? I have friends who have autistic children, and yet what do they come back saying? They say, oh, well, this child has been a blessing in my life. This woman, over time, writes, she says, it took me a few years. But after a few years, I realized I too wouldn't change a thing. Because this girl wasn't Down syndrome. She was my daughter. And she says the light and the innocence and just the way she went about life was different than other people. And yeah, it has its problems, some logistical and practical problems. But the Down syndrome also has its benefits in the sense that we see life from a different point of view. And she says, I wouldn't change a thing. She writes, it happened first through my eyes adjusting. What had seemed so abnormal, so unnatural, slowly became to me greater and more glorious than normal. That line, she writes, it first happened through my eyes adjusting. Really rang for me. And it brings us into the story we have this week from the Gospel of John, where the blind man now sees. Her eyes needed adjusting, and a blind man, I guess you could call that an eye adjustment as well. And you've probably heard this story before, and it's short and powerful, but the point of it is, and I want you to just kind of have this punchline at the end, in your mind as we go through it. The man says, I know one thing. I was blind, and now I can see. And that's kind of the whole theme of today, is that I was blind, and now I can see. That mom who had the Down syndrome baby in utero and was worrying about it, she was blind. But she says, basically, now I can see. Now I get it. Now I get it. And as we look at the story of Jesus healing the man blind, think about it in terms of what's being healed, right? It's one thing to have a physical affliction. We all have problems with our bodies, right? Raise your hand if you don't have a problem with your body, right? Knees, elbows, whatever, we have stuff. These are all things that drive us nuts at times. But what's more important, to have those problems healed or to have the soul healed? We can do this the easy way or the hard way. We're going to have a chance here to have a soul healing, a spirit healing, something much more. And listen to how Jesus does this healing. So this is from Gospel of John, chapter 9. We're going to go to verses 1 to probably about 25 is where we'll stop. Now as Jesus passed by, he saw a man who was blind from birth, and his disciples asked him, saying, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but the works of God should be revealed in him. I must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. The night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. When he said these things, he spat on the ground and made clay with saliva, and he anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay. And he said to him, go and wash in the pool of Siloam, which is translated sent. So he went and washed, and he came back seeing. Therefore the neighbors and those who had previously seen that he was blind, said, is this not he who sat and begged? Some said, this is he. Others said, he is like him. And he said, I am he. Therefore they said to him, how were your eyes opened? He answered and said, a man called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and said to me, go to the pool of Siloam and wash. So I went and I washed and I received sight. They said to him, where is he? Right? He's blind. How would he know where he is? I don't know. They brought him, who was formerly blind, to the Pharisees, and now it was a Sabbath when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. Then the Pharisees also asked him again how he had received his sight. He said to them, he put clay on my eyes. I washed, and I see. Therefore some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, because he does not keep the Sabbath." Others said, "How can a man who is a sinner do such signs?" And there was a division among them. They said to the blind man again, "What do you say about him, because he has opened your eyes? He is a prophet." But the Jews did not believe anything concerning him, that he had been blind and received his sight, until they called the parents of him who had received his sight. They asked him, "Is this your son, who you say was born blind? How then does he see now?" His parents answered them and said, "We know that this is our son, and that he was born blind. But by what means he now sees, we do not know. Or who opened his eyes, we do not know. He is of age. Ask him. He will speak for himself." His parents said these things because they feared the Jews. The Jews had agreed already that if anyone confessed that he was Christ, he would be put out of synagogue. Therefore his parents said, "He is of age. Ask him." So they again called the man who was born blind and said to him, "Give God the glory. We know that this man is a sinner." And he answered and said, "Whether he is a sinner or not, I do not know. One thing I know, that though I was blind, now I see." Now I see. And they go on for the next few verses, and they debate whether this guy was good or not. And I think the reason that we stop here is that, isn't that what it's all about? This guy had a direct experience with God. No rational argument is going to come in the way of that to undo it. He's not going to go, I'm not going to go back to being blind. No, I'm not going to do that. I have sight. I have sight. And we get into these discussions at times with people who don't believe in any God, and they point to the suffering of the world and say, "Look, these terrible things have happened. Look at it. How can God be in control here?" You don't have to look on the news for very long to find terrible things. People who are child abusers, people who go around and taking advantage of women, sex trafficking. The list goes on and on and on, forgetting about just the robberies and thefts and that kind of lower level crime. There's lots of stuff, and people suffer as a result of it. So these Pharisees are saying, "Hey, can't you see this isn't God?" That's what they're putting before the guy. And the guy's coming back saying, No, now I see. Correspondentially, what is going on here? Why is it that this blind man sees now and he didn't before? Well, what the word shows us is all dirt, right? So Jesus takes some dirt, which is basically earth. He takes natural perceptions of things. So you look at the world around you, all the little facts and things that you know. Jesus, through the mouth of God, spits on them. So water, saliva is basically water. You add truth to all the things that you know, and the Lord, through His mouth, gives life to it. So the Lord is giving you life to all the stuff that you know through His truth, puts it on your eyes. The pool of Siloam is basically a symbol for the Scriptures, the Old and the New Testament. And it's being washed of all the false ideas that you have from the Scripture. So your sight is brought back because of truth being added from the Lord and false ideas washed away. That's what this story is, in simple, a picture of. And it stands over time as an important story, not because a man's sight was healed. If healing sight was the important thing, the Lord would have come and healed everybody's sight, right? But He wants to heal our souls, our spirit. And this story can sit there and show us for all time how the Lord can heal our spirit. And it's through Him. It's through believing in what He says and washing away all the false ideas that come to us by way of the world. And when we've had that experience, it changes us. I want to read you another little short one of a person who had this kind of experience. This man, his name was Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Solzhenitsyn? All right. Well, I was hoping somebody would know what that is. But so, all right. Does anybody know who this guy is? Cliff knows. Hey, this is a guy who was in the Soviet Union in the early part of the 1900s and spoke against the Soviet Union, saying, Stalin, you're doing it wrong. You are not a nice person. And as a result, he gets thrown into a gulag, a Soviet prison. And this is a short version of what he writes. He says, it was granted to me to carry away from my prison years on my bent back, which nearly broke beneath its load, this essential experience, how a human being becomes evil and how good. In the intoxication of youthful success, I had felt myself to be infallible, and I was therefore cruel. In the surfeit of power, I was a murderer and an oppressor. And in my most evil moments, I was convinced that I was doing good, and I was well supplied with systematic arguments. It was only when I lay there on the rotting prison straw that I sensed within myself the first stirrings of good. Gradually it was disclosed to me that the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart, and through all human hearts. This is why I turn back to the years of my imprisonment and lay, sometimes to the astonishment of those about me, and say, bless you, prison. I have served enough time there. I nourished my soul there, and I say without hesitation, bless you, prison, for having been in my life. I mean, can you imagine that? Would you take the winning lottery ticket or the losing lottery ticket? Winning lottery ticket. I don't want to be in prison, right? This is not a difficult choice. Do you want a child with Down syndrome or not? No, of course I don't. Do you want to be in prison in a Soviet concentration camp? No, of course I don't want that. These are all terrible things, right? The Lord's saying, you know what? A lot of good can come out of suffering. A lot of good can come out of suffering. And it's hard for us to wrap our minds around it. But we get in those states and we have the opportunity to really experience God. If we're really going to find peace, we find healing in those moments. We reflect on all these things and say, oh, boy, what's really going on here? What's really important? What's really me? You know? A young woman has a diving accident, becomes a paraplegic at age 17, can't move arms or legs. Oh my gosh, my life is over. God, how can you expect me to deal with this? That was 50 years ago. Now she runs an organization running retreats all around the world, helping people, teaching them how to get through these things, how to have a God-centric life, and how through God they too can survive whatever catastrophe that has afflicted them. Paralysis, terminal disease. It's about seeing the joy in suffering. I mean, isn't that crazy? Paul tells us, hey, rejoice, and it's all joy. But that's what these people are doing. They are taking people who were blind because all they're doing is ordering their life by natural circumstance, right? Everything they're seeing is about natural things going on in the world. Oh, well, this person's blind. It must be bad. But divine love and wisdom tells us that the understanding opens the eye, but the eye of the world closes the understanding. Our understanding, our spiritual understanding and concepts of the world open our eyes to see that, you know what? Yeah, we think we don't want those things, but they actually can turn out good for us. That woman who was the paraplegic, I mean, she had all this huge organization, all this good work being done that would have never happened had she not had that diving accident. Never happened. We're not good arbiters of our own destiny, which is why we always have to sit there and say, you know what, I may not like this, this is challenging, but the Lord says, be strong and of good courage. And whatever suffering has fallen upon us, we too can get through that as well. Amen.